the program we're talking about today is managing earthquake waste and contaminated sites. It is what I'm going to talk about today is very much a joint initiative and a great deal of joint work. Carl Diamond, who unfortunately can't be here, is actually the project leader for that across the agencies. As it outlined there, it's projects 14 and 15 of the NERP, and basically we've got waste and we've got contaminated land. And I guess just to give you an idea of sort of where that sits in the themes that sit within the Natural Environment Recovery Program. I will say now, you'll find today there are going to be a few acronyms. So I will explain those as we go through, and I guess the outcome of today for us is to actually talk a bit about what's happened since the events in October 20 or September 2010 and February 2011, and the work that's happened and continues to happen. So I'll just go straight into it. So basically SHARE, it's not a singer, it's the Combined Health and Environmental Risk Group. Now that group is a sort of evolved from the agencies of Christchurch City Council, Environment Canterbury, Waimakariri and Selwyn councils, who were working quite closely immediately after the events in initial response. And now that's broadened out a little bit as things have progressed and the issues sort of continue to evolve to also include SERA. I mean, as it morphed from civil defence into SERA, obviously it come with us. WorkSafe New Zealand, key to that around health and safety. Canterbury District Health Board, also very key because it's around health as well as around the environment. And Ministry for the Environment as in terms of their position too. The key thing with this is it's about bringing together agencies to collectively understand issues, understand the matters, and work on them together. Because what we found very early on was that the issues we were dealing with, we could easily work on them in isolation, but to get better solutions and better outcomes, we needed to work collectively. And so that's what we set up. And this group primarily sitting at a strategic and a policy level, and at that statutory level too if it's needed. And we're looking ahead. So we're looking current issues, current matters, but we're trying to look ahead and get in front of issues and get collective responses ready so it maintains rebuild and recovery momentum. And the big thing is about that agency alignment. From that, we created WEMT, or from those agencies. WEMT, Waste and Earthquake Management Team. They're not sexy names, but they describe quite adequately what this is all about. And I guess what happened immediately after events was we recognised that a business as usual way wasn't going to cut it, and so we pulled this team together. As you can see, it's funded collectively by a number of local councils and SERA, and will be continuing to be funded for the next 12 to 24 months because we still see a need for it. Really focused on earthquake waste and where it went. I mean, as you can appreciate, early on, a lot of waste, bigger volumes than probably seen really in history before in Christchurch or in other areas, and we wanted to make sure that that's disposed of in the appropriate way and managed in the appropriate way. As most of you know, we sit on our drinking water aquifers, and so the maintenance of keeping those in a state that they're usable and protected was very, very key, and all the agencies agreed on that, as well as into the future about the health issues for the community and residents involved. So we look at the whole regulatory spectrum and the work that this team does. It's made up of a team of 5 people. 5 people that come from Environment Canterbury and Christchurch City Council, and one had experience also in WorkSafe, a health and safety role too, prior to that coming here. So the regulatory spectrum, it's about education, it's about communication, but also we've got the stick at the end for those that don't behave, and we have gone through a number of processes and taken action where necessary under whatever legislation was required, whether that was through Christchurch City Council, through Environment Canterbury processes. It evolved over time, as these things do, with recovery, and now focuses on, an element of it focuses on the support of EQCs, land repair and the land remediation with that. Other projects too is around asbestos website, asbestos aware website, and the residential red zone hazardous waste removal project. And we wanted to get some independence of WEMT, because as agencies, it's public money we've used, and we're very conscious of the fact that it has to be doing an effective job. So, and we're also looking to continue some funding, so support those funding bids, but also to provide that peace of mind to you and to us that this is effective. We had an independent inquiry and that audit, and that's come back very successful. So it's a great initiative, having the agencies working together and tackling issues collectively. One of the key projects that was sort of kicked off very early on with the clearance of a number of properties, residential properties through the residential red zones in Waimakariri and Christchurch City. Concern was that what was in those houses and how they'd be demolished, and particularly we were focused on household waste. Over the years, councils in Canterbury have run annual events where people could remove their materials free of charge or at small cost for chemicals that they had, or paints and things. We thought, well, if those houses are going to be demolished, there's a risk there if they aren't handled properly, some of those chemicals, that it could get into land and create further issues. So hence, thinking ahead, trying to avoid issues before they started. Collectively, councils applied for the Ministry for Environment, got over $1+ million worth of money, plus local funds and management here. And to date, as you can see, the numbers are there. 6,627 properties are checked. 1,761 of those required clearance. 323 tonne of material was removed. I think about 80% of that, roughly, was actually household paints. But we have had some persistent chemicals as well that had to be removed, and in one or two instances those materials can't actually be disposed of in New Zealand and have to be sent offshore for proper handling. The next phase of that is moving off the flatlands into the Port Hills, and so we're looking to continue to extend that process and the funding to match that to support SERA and clearances there. One aspect that I haven't put up there is that this information we're gathering about what people actually hold in their houses in terms of household chemicals is actually quite of interest nationwide for other councils and programs they run. So the data that we're actually gathering here is being shared too. So that's another aspect too that's coming out of Christchurch. So some key things now that are happening with the team. As I said earlier, they're about education and it's about communication. We're working with industry around some waste streams, and that's as a collective group on things like timber and how it can be handled, plasterboard, where it can go to, concrete and the crushing of it and reuse of things. A lot of this work, as it says, not only involves the public but also the private sectors, because there's opportunities there for commercial uses and commercial businesses to function and be set up in this process. A lot of it also is coming around to focusing on alternative reduction, reuse and recycling recovery and better disposal. And there's some work going on around reducing the construction waste at the front end too, with the recovery going on. I guess there's the word that's gone around of late, and I mentioned it earlier, was asbestos. Asbestos has been a matter, or some people may call it an issue, that's been part of the recovery to date. And I think there's some very good measures in place with the agencies talking and working constructively together around getting greater understanding out there to the industry, into the demolition, into the construction, and people involved in repairing homes, what's the issues are with asbestos and how to manage it, how to handle it, and also very importantly how to appropriately dispose of it. To give you an idea, you can see that the change in scale. They're going from about 75 tonne a month in 2009 up to about 1,650 tonne a month being disposed of. Now that material and its disposal is generally handled by approved, or it is in all cases handled by licensed and approved handlers. It's double bagged, double wrapped, and has a one-way trip to North Canterbury, where it's then appropriately disposed of into the landfill and marked for future reference. I guess a key thing here is to identify that difference between what the hazard is versus what the risk is. So we have sites that where demolitions have occurred, some of the asbestos may still be present, have some presence in the soils or the foundations that are coming out. All that information is gathered and those sites are monitored and they're worked with as they are developed and recovery and rebuilds occur. We actually held some joint risk workshops as agencies to understand really what the risks were, and right from health and safety component of it on sites, right through to then the sites at the end of it and the disposal of it. And all the work has sort of culminated really on not only just on the groundwork with agencies going out and meeting and talking to these construction industry people, but we've created an asbestos aware website. And that's got all the information on there from agencies, and even we're taking feedback from the community. We held a workshop, if you like, in early December. We had 60 or 70, about the same size crowd as here today, of residents and people from the construction industry coming to hear from an asbestos specialist who talked about the hazard and the risk component of it and how to handle it. We had also officers from WorkSafe talking about the responsibilities of people and homeowners, and we spoke about it from a perspective of making sure it's disposed of appropriately and doing that. One thing that people may have also experienced in the last 12 months was contaminated land. We, Environment Canterbury, and carried out what's called a HAIL survey. So that stands for Hazardous Activities and Industries List, which basically is looking at the past land uses of properties in Christchurch. And that was to support EQC's land repair. Now, why did we do that? We did that because if the land was going to be repaired and the soil was removed off that property and it had the potential to be, or was found to be, contaminated, we wanted to make sure that it was disposed of in the right place. That sort of material isn't the sort of stuff you want going out as clean fill and being put into quarries. A lot of that material goes to the appropriate place for disposal, which once again going up to North Canterbury. Now, we've got a greater idea now. We've identified 11,000 properties that are potentially contaminated. In the process of working with the building industry, insurers, and the people who are involved in the earth moving, is making sure they know what to do, having good site management plans in place, and understanding what they need to do when they discover things. The WEMP team actually has a key role in that. In terms of they're the eyes and ears out there, they are monitoring these sites, they're working with the industry, sharing that information and making sure that they're doing as they should, and if need be, taking people to task. One thing there is that the insurers, to keep this process moving, have applied for what are called global consents. So rather than have to go in there to get a consent for each individual property to work on, they can get a consent that applies for the Christchurch City environment or area, and then they work within that consent on each site and apply those conditions individually. As I said, that's about reducing delays and it's about consistency. The next steps that collectively as councils and agencies we're looking at is a website on the contaminants in soil for the public, as much as we've done with asbestos. Because the feedback we're getting, the amount of hits on the asbestos website showing there's a great interest in the community for this type of information. The feedback we get, we are then adding to those sites to also answering their frequently asked questions. So the future, as a collective group, for the next 12 to 24 months, we'll continue to focus on opportunities that are out there and issues that we may face in recovery. Very much a strong focus on education and also that monitoring and recovery. We'll continue as always to support the innovation and waste in the recycling sector, that's key. We'll have a continued focus on asbestos and increased action on contaminants in the soils. And I guess the culmination of this work of 4 or 5 years, I guess by then, more, will be a practical based toolkit for next time. I won't be here. I don't plan to be. I'll be on a bus or a plane elsewhere. But we've learnt a lot, and we're sharing a lot. As I talked about earlier, the information and data we're gathering for the removal of waste from homes is being shared. The tools and the information that Charlotte's going to talk a bit about as well is very, very valuable information for civil defence and emergency management practices elsewhere. And it doesn't have to be an earthquake, it could be nice to be a flood or something smaller, it'd be good. But I guess the picture here is to demonstrate the stick end, literally and figuratively there by look at that photo, because there's lots of timber in that picture. But this is a recent site, as you can see, middle of November last year, where some inappropriate disposal has been uncovered. And that's continuing on a path now of action between councils. So I'll leave that there.
Thank you very much, Don. I mean, I've got lots and lots of questions, I'm sure you have. So, but in the meantime, we'll have Charlotte Brown she's based both with CPIT, with the Polytech, and also with the Resilient Organisations Research Group at University of Canterbury. So Charlotte, in 2012, completed her thesis looking at disaster waste management. So she probably looks at more at a systems approach, and I think we'll have a really interesting presentation. She's got a really flash presentation using different formats, so watch out.
Well, hi everyone. As Chrissy said, my name is Charlotte. So for those of you who can do the maths, I finished my PhD in 2012. So I started in 2009, and someone very fortuitously gave me suggested a topic of how let's start to think about how we would manage solid waste after a disaster event. So halfway through my study, I got a real-time case study in Christchurch. So as unfortunate it was really good that I helped with the initial civil defence response with Don and a number of others in the early stages of Sarah, so trying to set up a waste management system for Christchurch and trying to bring in some of the experiences that I'd got from my research in overseas. So as Chrissy said, I'm going to talk about it in a bit of a more high-level approach and sort of think about the lessons we could learn from what has happened in Christchurch with the waste and how we might go about preparing for it in the future. So I'm a systems thinker, so I think in pictures and circles, not in a linear way. So I'm going to talk about these 6 different areas, so strategic management, funding mechanisms, operational management, environmental and human health risk management, and legislation and regulations. And I'll finish off talking about the disaster impacts. The first one is the strategic management. So after the earthquakes, before the earthquakes, there was very little thought given to disaster waste. There were some operational plans available. Christchurch City Council, for example, had done one for their waste management. But there was no real thought about who would be suitable to manage the waste and to help determine where the waste would go, what sort of legislation would need to be in place and do all the monitoring and sort of be in charge of the strategic approach to that waste management. And I think that's something we can really reflect on and take the experiences of as Don was talking, of the organisations that have been set up, such as the CHER, the CHER, and the WEMT, and say, well, are these models that we could actually put in place so that they're there before the event occurs, and so when the event occurs, the right people come together and we can hit the ground running. It took us a while after the earthquakes to set up a good group and the right processes to get going. So whose role is that? Is it a national government thing? Should it be led by Ministry for the Environment, or should it be led at a local level, ECAN, or at an operational level, perhaps at City Council? And that might change depending on the scale of the disaster. So we really need to think through that. Who would be a good person to lead, both from a strategic point of view and an operational point of view? So the next aspect I wanted to talk about is funding mechanisms. So largely what I've seen in disasters overseas is the way that the waste is managed is largely driven by how it is funded. So in the States, for example, they have an established funding mechanism through FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And after an event, the Federal Emergency Management Agency gets together and they set up a contract for contractors to go and pick up all the waste, and all the residents put their waste out on the front yard and it gets collected. And it's all centrally managed and centrally paid, and so it's very well controlled. Everyone knows what's happening because there are contractors that are put in charge of it, and they do all the monitoring, all the data collection, and they're held responsible at the end of the day. What we saw in Christchurch was a largely private-led or funded demolition and waste management. So we had individual sites being dealt with by individual organisations and contractors, largely funded by insurers. And so what that led to is a lot of different approaches in how to manage waste. And there was very little oversight and, dare I say, control over what was happening. And that links a little bit into the legislation and regulations we had in place, but I'll talk about that a bit later. So what we found was sometimes some contractors would do a lot of recycling where others would not. Some people would decide to take their waste out to an illegal dump site out west in Christchurch, and others would do it by the book. So we really had little oversight as to what was happening, both in terms of the quality and the speed of the recovery. So again, I think we need to think through that. What funding mechanisms are likely to be in place after a disaster? And this will probably change depending on the nature of the hazard. So if we've got something like an earthquake, all the waste is pretty contained. So if a house collapses, it's all on the one side. But if you get something like a hurricane or a flood, the waste starts to move. It goes off the private property and it goes into public property. And that's when insurers will, I'm projecting here, but they're likely to put their hands up and say, it's not our job, and public money's going to have to come in. And so we need to sort of think about that. Do we have the funding mechanisms available, and what are the processes to do that? Okay, the next aspect I want to talk about is operational management. So we need to think about where the waste is going, what dump sites are available, what recycling facilities are available, and where is the waste being generated. So I've drawn this very simplified process of what I think happened in Christchurch. On the left-hand side, there's a list of different places where waste was generated. So there was, for example, in the central city, immediately after the earthquakes, Civil Defence and Sarah had a commercial demolition program, the Section 38 notices, you might remember. So that was one source of waste. But then there was residential demolition and repair work being led by the project management officers and insurers. And then there was owners doing their own thing, particularly in the commercial area. They'd often take an insurance payout and then they would be managing the demolition. And then there was private property owners doing their own thing. And then there was the liquefaction silt, which the volunteer armies were picking up and councils were collecting. So there were all these different sources of waste. And they were going in all sorts of different directions. Some were going through to processing sites. So we had Burwood set up. Hopefully a lot of you are familiar with that. So Burwood was set up to take mixed demolition wastes, and there's now been a recycling facility set up there to process the waste over the next 4 or 5 years or so. Some of the waste went directly to transfer stations, so that's part of the normal waste management process. And then sometimes the waste was sorted on site and then taken straight to recycling markets, so metal scrapyards and clean fill disposal sites and land reclamation. So there was a whole lot of things happening. And I think this sort of visualisation is a really useful thing to do before the event. So think about, for a certain event or hazard or disaster, where is the waste going to come from? Who's going to be responsible for that waste? And where do we want it to go? I've set up, as part of the work I did as my PhD, sort of set up a template where people could start to think about that. And I think it's important to first think about where the waste is sourced, where it comes from, how you're going to handle it. Is there an intermediate handling you need to do to separate the waste? Is there any treatment that's needed? Perhaps it's hazardous material, or you need to physically separate the materials because it's become intertwined through the process of the hazard. And then at the end of the day, where's it going to go? And also thinking about this, particularly at the end here, the final disposal and end use. What are the capacities of the existing sites, the existing recycling material facilities and the existing disposal sites? And for the hazard scenarios we're looking at, is there enough capacity there? Or do we need to think about emergency facilities? So as a part of a planning process, I think that's quite an important step. The next thing in the operational side is looking at recycling, how to do recycling. And this was a bit of a controversial thing, I think, after the earthquakes, because initially when we started the program, there was a low recycling in the central city. There was an urgency for the speed of the demolition. So this was for a number of reasons. It was to help clear the roads to allow for emergency vehicles to get through. It was to reduce the danger for all the urban search and rescue people who are working in the central city. You don't want to have buildings that are likely to collapse in an aftershock around where there's search and rescue operators working. And then there was also the fact that to do really good on-site recycling or on-site separation of materials, you really need to send teams into the building to do an internal strip out of the building before you start to deconstruct it piece by piece. And a lot of the buildings in the central city in particular were too dangerous for that. You couldn't really send teams in because there was, especially with the number of aftershocks, there were too many risks for doing that. So that's why there was initial reluctance to do on-site separation. And as time went on, there started to be more and more on-site separation. As those risks reduced, the aftershocks died down, and the urgency for the demolition was reduced, and people wanted to start to save money because often, if you separate on site, it's a lower cost. So there was this real tension, I think, between the environmentally responsible approach of separating on site and getting as much recyclable materials out of the demolition as possible, balancing that with safety and speed of the demolition. And it was a real tension, and I think after an event you really need to think about where are your priorities and to design your waste management process to meet those priorities. So after the earthquakes, I think in Christchurch it was really, initially there was a real emphasis on the speed of the demolition and the safety of the process, and so that's why there was less recycling. But after another event those priorities might change. So it's important to think about those before and after an event. So the next thing is managing risks. So I'm going to talk about environmental risk and human health risk together. There were a number of risks, and Don has talked about a few of them, such as asbestos. I've talked about the safety of workers around unstable buildings. I think we have to just do our normal risk management processes after an earthquake, but there's a couple of subtle but important changes we need to think about. And the first one I have on there is you've got to recognise and determine that there are different risk perceptions. There's different risks of what is acceptable or tolerable risk and what is not. And you need to take time to understand that. And that's about talking to the community that you're working in and the people that are involved in the waste management process. So those perceptions will have to change. And I think after the earthquakes there was a bit of risk averseness. People didn't want to have dump sites in their backyards. They didn't want to have trucks rumbling past their properties with potentially asbestos asbestos in the dust from the vehicles. So you need to recognise that and address that. The second is to accept that there are definitely going to be higher risks. You've got potentially 10, 20, 30, 40 times as much waste as you're used to dealing with. You've probably got that many more people managing the waste, and those people are likely to be unskilled. They wouldn't have worked in the waste sector before, and here they are having to deal with waste and deal with hazards that they don't know much about, and they don't know the risks. And I think that's really important. There is going to be higher risks, and you have to manage the process or set up the process to cope with those higher risks. Something like asbestos, for example, we did some education sessions quite soon after the earthquakes to some contractors, and I was amazed at how few of them knew what asbestos looked like or what the hazards were. And I think trying to educate, as Don was saying, about those sorts of hazards is really, really important, and also setting up processes that make sure people don't put themselves at those risks that they don't know about. And then the other stages are just normal risk management process. So recognising those higher risks, put mitigations in place. So if you think there's going to be asbestos, it's a house that's been built before the 1980s, then as a standard practice, spray water if you're doing any demolition work just to compress the dust and make sure you've got apparatus on. You know, there's simple steps that can help to mitigate the risks without being too cumbersome for the contractors. Monitoring is really important, so making sure that you don't skimp on those monitoring. I think because there's a rush after the disaster, everyone wants to get on with it, and there's a lot of work. Sometimes you can let go of those processes like monitoring risks. I think it's important to keep that. And communication of the risks is important as well. Being open and honest about the risks with everyone, not trying to hide them. I think there's a tendency not to scaremonger. I think there is a way to communicate risks without scaremongering and making sure that everyone understands what's going on and what mitigation measures are in place. So the last thing that I think is a really good lesson from the Canterbury earthquakes is something that encompasses all of that, and that's the legislation and regulation that supports all of those different aspects. What we found after the earthquakes was that there wasn't a lot of legislation in place to help us monitor and keep an eye on the private demolition works. So there's very little requirement for people to have, for example, a disaster waste management plan. It was only if your building was a certain size would you be responsible for having a disaster waste management plan. Other than that, it was up to you what you did, and there was very little way of monitoring it. And so consequently we have very little data about what waste was generated, what kind of waste, where it went, and who was managing it. So, and without that data, it's very difficult to monitor and to help improve the process for this event and for future events. So thinking about whether or not we need to have better legislation and better vision of what's happening with that waste is something to think about. We also, after the earthquakes, ended up having to consent a few additional sites, additional waste management sites. I've mentioned one already, the Burwood recovery site, so for recycling and recovering of the mixed materials. And we also had Littleton. So Littleton Port Company wanted to take some of the inert debris for land reclamation. And so both of those processes required they both required consent, but as an interim they also required an emergency, well particularly the Burwood site required an emergency approval under the Civil Defence Act. So I think thinking through the process of what are our legislations and regulations, and if we needed to set up extra waste management facilities, or if we needed to have more oversight of the waste and where it was going and who was handling it, what legislation needs to be in place. I think we need to do that review to make sure next time we have those processes and we're not held up by legislation, but that we're also making sure that we cover off all the risks and all the processes that we need to get a good quality solution, not just rushing into it and potentially putting ourselves in the risk of having an environmental damage. So I just want to finish off, if we're thinking about future planning for disasters, thinking of a different way to think about disasters. So not just thinking about hazards, not thinking about, okay, what do we do if we have a flood or if we have an earthquake or a volcano, Thinking in more general terms about the disaster impacts. So I think there's 9 key things that determine how we manage our waste after an event. Some of those are to do with what the disaster is like, and some of those are to do with what the waste is like after the disaster. So in terms of the disaster, I think if you have a different scale event, that'll lead to a different response. If you have displaced persons, that leads to a different response. The other things are geographical extent of the waste. So is it spread over a large area, or is it very confined? How long the hazard event is. So is it a one-off, we'll say earthquake event, ignoring all the aftershocks, or is it something like a volcanic event, which could go on for months, or potentially longer than that? And disruption of the road network is another thing. In terms of the waste, things that will change what you do is the volume of waste. So if you've got a small volume of waste and you can manage it with your existing waste management system, it's probably not a problem. But if you're dealing with 10, 20 times what you normally deal with in a year, you're going to need additional facilities. So it's just a different scale of approach. The human health hazards, so whether or not it's easy for people to handle the waste, whether the waste has been moved across property boundaries, so I mentioned that before, and the physical difficulty of handling waste. So has the process of the hazard, has it ended up mixing the waste so that it's beyond separation and recycling is not an option? And if so, again, that's going to completely change your approach if you originally favoured a full recycling approach, for example. So because of the plethora of disaster events and hazards that we would face, it does become difficult to plan because you don't know what scenario to plan for. So I suggest this is a different approach, just looking at the impacts, because that's going to help you have, I guess, leverage points, so to say. If this changes, then how would that change our response? It just helps to streamline your planning for disaster events. And I would advocate this as an approach for all sorts of disaster planning, not just waste. Because we live in a multi-hazard world and we don't know what we don't know. So there's always going to be some unexpected black swan event that happens. And so we need to start thinking about planning for the unknowns rather than planning for what we know. Okay, so that's a little bit of a reflection on what happened and where we might go from here.